Hello everybody. What I would like to do today is have a look at one of my favourite poems from the Poems of the Decade anthology for Edexcel English Literature A-Level, and that poem is Roderick Ford's Giuseppe. This poem is significant to me because for me it marks the step up from GCSE to A-Level study, not only due to the quite sensitive subject matter that the poem explores, but also due to the fact that the strategies of technique spotting and feature spotting will only get you really so far in understanding this poem. It is a poem that interrogates the reader. It wants us to scrutinise its overarching themes and questions, and this goes quite far beyond just a surface analysis of the language used. Now, if you haven't studied this poem before, it essentially documents the killing of the last captive mermaid on the shores of Sicily. And if you look at the slides here on this opening, the images on this opening slide, this really encapsulates what Ford does so well in this poem. He blends myth, folklore, and the legend of mermaids with the very real historical context of World War II. And this incongruous mix of myth and historical realism is really what gives this poem resonance. It's what makes it memorable. So if we look at the first stanza of this poem, it says, "My uncle Giuseppe told me that in Sicily in World War II." Okay, just from these opening two lines, we are aware that the speaker of the poem is recounting a story told to him by his uncle. And it is set in a very real place in Sicily and at a very real time and context in World War II. In the courtyard behind the aquarium, now I've italicised that line but I'll return to it later, where the bougainvillea grows so well. Bougainvillea is that plant up there, or bougainvillea, depending on how you pronounce it, is that plant up there in the top left. It was originated in South America, I believe, but it's quite commonly found in the Mediterranean. So in the courtyard behind the aquarium, the only captive mermaid in the world. Only, again, implying a sense of uniqueness, something precious, something of value, but it's kept captive. It's not free. But the only captive mermaid in the world was butchered on the dry and dusty ground. Now this quite emotive verb, butchered, we associate with the killing and slaughter of animals. So already we get a sense of the dehumanization of the mermaid. And we've got a little bit of plosive alliteration here with the dry and dusty ground, emphasising the barren landscape in which this took place. And it was done, and this is most striking in the first stanza, it was done by a doctor, a fishmonger, and certain others. Now, a mermaid is a hybrid between a woman and a fish, or a human and an animal. And here we have both sides represented in this doctor and the fishmonger. So a doctor as somebody who we associate with having a comprehensive knowledge of the human body, and a fishmonger as having a comprehensive knowledge of fish and animals. So we've got the human and the animal represented in these two figures. But Giuseppe, when recounting his story, is quite keen to emphasise that there were also certain others, that in some respects this was a community act, that there were numerous people complicit in this crime. But I think quite shocking here is the fact that a doctor oversaw this killing. And a doctor is not only somebody who we associate with knowledge, but also they are figures of authority and trust. So despite this being a community act, notice how Ford zooms in on these pockets of society. Now, for those of you who don't know, Sicily is an island off of southern Italy, and during 1943, in World War II, the Allied forces of Britain and America invaded Sicily as part of Operation Husky. Now, this was part of a campaign to take Italy, who at the time were allied with the fascist regime in Nazi Germany. And during World War II, and for a time after, there were mass food shortages, a period of famine. So there was quite a lot of starvation happening on these islands, and Sicily itself has always been long associated with mermaid legends. So we already see here again this blend of a real historical context of World War II and the myth and legend of mermaids. It had never learned to speak because she was simple, or so they'd said. Now this is really significant. Notice this hesitancy, this caesura, this pause at the start of the line. It had never learned to speak. She, we probably associate with a lot more human emotion in that pronoun. It is just a thing. It's another. It's a thing. And it's almost as if Giuseppe is trying to convince himself that this mermaid was not human. But notice, despite this initial hesitancy, she is used again. We've got her throat, she is used again, and she is used again. She is used all throughout this stanza, despite this initial pause with it. So Giuseppe is trying to dehumanize this mermaid and provide justification for this killing. The first thing that they said was that she never learned to speak and that she was simple. And then we move on to our second figure of authority, the priest. Think how significant that is in Catholic Sicily. And the priest, who held one of her hands while her throat was cut, almost as if he's giving her her last rites, said that she was only a fish, and fish can't speak. So even the priest here is saying she can't speak, so she must just be a fish. He's trying to justify these actions, and this is immediately undermined by one of the most significant lines of the poem. But she screamed like a woman in terrible fear. Now this is the only simile in the poem, but what a simile to use, because this simile links the mermaid directly with humanity. She doesn't scream like an animal in fear. She doesn't howl like a wolf. She screamed like a woman in terrible fear. So they try and assert at the start of this stanza that it's only a fish. But this is immediately undermined by the only simile in the poem, by saying that she screamed like a woman in terrible fear. And when they took the ripe golden roe, so roe, essentially fish eggs, from the top right, if any of you are sushi fans, then you might see those orange dots that go around the rolls, that's roe. And when they took a ripe golden roe, again, one of the few instances of descriptive language here, they took this roe from her side. The doctor said that this was proof that she was just a fish. And anyway, an egg is not a child, but refused when some was offered to him. Now this is significant. The doctor, who again, as I said, we associate with having a comprehensive knowledge of the human body, and if he was that confident that this mermaid had nothing to do with humanity, then why would he be so reluctant to taste some of the eggs? So think about the proofs that they've already tried to get for this killing. She was simple. She couldn't speak. She's got golden eggs. All of this is trying to deny the humanity of the mermaid, and he refused when some was offered to him. Some of you also might have picked up here on the doctor's assertion that the egg is not a child, and how that we can imagine might contrast with how the priest might view it, particularly when you think about the context of the Catholic Church and their views on abortion. So this is a real strong implication of guilt, and this undercurrent of guilt is really drip-fed throughout this poem. Then they put her head and her hands in a box for burial, and someone tried to take her wedding ring. Now this someone isn't named. Perhaps he was one of the certain others that's mentioned in the first stanza, again highlighting the fact that this is an act in which many of the community are involved in. So somebody tried to take her wedding ring, but the others stopped him. Now, I want you to think carefully about what this symbol of the wedding ring represents. It is a symbol of love. Even more so, it is a symbol of human love. And it is also a symbol of security and protection. Something that the mermaid might have expected but was eventually unable to receive. Now, given the World War II context of the poem, it's difficult not to draw parallels between the treatment of the mermaid and the treatment of the Jews in Nazi Germany. And this act of taking the wedding ring recalls events that were commonplace in the concentration camps. And if you look at these two pictures here, you'll see glasses frames, bits of jewellery, brooches, wedding rings. They were all taken upon entry, and the metal would eventually be salvaged. And this was also a method of stripping away humanity and stripping away identity, something that we also see happen to the mermaid in this poem. Now, I did want to just share a little bit from the Edexcel poem commentary, because I think they really summarise this section of the poem quite well. Their strategy is to deny her any humanity. They talk of proof using her physical difference and supposed mental incapacity as an excuse for what they do. So, they say that she lays golden eggs. They say that she was simple. They say that she can't speak. All of these excuses act as supposed justification for what they have done and the killing. In this, they recall the arguments that set forth by the Nazi regime and other totalitarian authorities throughout history, bent on establishing racial superiority. Now, this is a process called othering, which I'll talk about in a second. However, as we've mentioned, the poem undermines their arguments at key points and demonstrates the perpetrators are lying to themselves. The doctor won't eat the roe offered to him. Now, this is a key moment and sign of guilt. But I would also like you to think about that simile, the fact that she screamed like a woman in terrible fear, as a way of undermining their attempts to dehumanize the mermaid. Most disturbing is the revelation that she was married, and that she had crossed into the human world of love, and might have expected protection from harm. That's a great way of putting it, highlighting the fact that the ring is a symbol of human love and also a symbol of security and protection. No one can quite bring themselves to remove her wedding ring despite the desecration of her body. Again, implying guilt. And perhaps what's most tragic about this is that the ripe golden roe that we see is actually a byproduct of this love, which again makes this killing even more tragic. Now, I mentioned that this process of othering occurs within the poem, and that is to view or treat a person or a particular group of people as intrinsically different and alien to oneself. Now, within this poem, they other the mermaid, but this process of othering is undermined at several stages. Another definition is that it's the perception or representation of a person or group of people as fundamentally alien from another, frequently more powerful group. Now, it's worth pointing out that the othering often occurs from a more powerful group, and we can both see that within the context of World War II, Nazi Germany and the Jews, and also within the poem Giuseppe. Think about how not just one person, but several sections of the Sicilian village community take part in this othering and this killing of the mermaid. The rest they cooked and fed to the troops. So, grounding this once again in historical context of the starvation and the famine, they said a large fish had been found on the beach. It's quite telling, isn't it, that they're not willing to say that it was a mermaid, and they've had to, again, lie and say that it was a fish. Starvation forgives men many things, my uncle, the aquarium keeper, said. Well, in the last stanza, it's quite dramatically revealed that Giuseppe is in fact the aquarium keeper. And remember, if we zoom back to the first stanza, we discover that this killing happened in the courtyard behind the aquarium. So from this, we can infer with quite a bit of authority that Giuseppe himself was well and truly heavily involved in the keeping, the capture perhaps, the captivity, and perhaps the killing of this mermaid. And Giuseppe tries to put up one last line of defence by saying that starvation forgives men many things. So he says that these food shortages, this famine, means that they acted they were forced to act in order to keep people fed. But again, guilt is imbued into this poem till the very end. So Giuseppe says that starvation forgives men many things, but couldn't look me in the eye, for which I thank God. So when recounting and telling his tale, he cannot look his own nephew in the eye, so he still feels this burden of guilt. And the fact that then these last two lines, we eventually get the judgment of the nephew. The nephew is glad that Giuseppe couldn't look him in the eye, for which I thank God. Ending this poem with the word God highlights how Giuseppe has acted outside of the usual moral boundaries, the usual moral parameters. He has acted in a transgressive manner. So, just to wrap up a little bit on the form and structure, the language and structure rather, of Giuseppe, it contains only one simile. Okay, and what a striking simile that is. Screamed like a woman in fear. And as a result, there is a lack of figurative and descriptive language. There are very few adjectives. I can think of large, golden, and not too many more after that. And as a result, the language really is deliberately quite flat, factual, and it concentrates on these actions without really much comment until we get to that judgment at the end. And this flat and factual language, in combination with it being written in free verse, without a rhyme scheme, without a regular strict rhythm or meter, creates, I believe, a quite confessional tone to the piece. Many have also argued that the fact that it's in free verse makes the story more realistic and convincing, as if he is really recounting a tale that could have been told in World War II. So I really think that all of this contributes to a quite, as I've said, confessional tone, that Giuseppe almost feels a compulsion to tell his story. And all of this is helped by Ford's use of a framing narrative. Now, as we know at the start, we can tell that the speaker is simply recounting a story told to him by his uncle Giuseppe. Now, this opens up a dual perspective on the events. Giuseppe's first-hand account is eventually wrapped up and couched within his nephew's judgmental point of view. It also allows Ford to quite dramatically reveal at the very end of the poem that Giuseppe was indeed the aquarium keeper and is therefore responsible for the captivity and the capture and must have been acquiescent in her slaughter and killing. So this guilt is eventually revealed at the end of the poem. So I really want you to think about what Ford might be telling us about the nature of guilt. I think personally that it's quite significant that Giuseppe ends up telling we get these layers of narration, don't we? And Giuseppe tells his story to his nephew, and the nephew tells his story to us. Almost in a kind of Rime of the Ancient Mariner type way, that Giuseppe feels this compulsion to tell his story, almost perhaps to try and alleviate a sense of guilt. And then, once the nephew has heard the story, he feels that he needs to tell it to us. And it's left to the reader to really get to the crux of the poem and to ask questions about the human capacity for evil, and really about what makes us human. So I think that it's quite striking that this guilt is passed on, and it's intergenerational. It goes from the uncle to the nephew to us, and almost, like I said, in a Rime of the Ancient Mariner type of way, it's almost as if Giuseppe feels he needs to remove this albatross from around his neck and relieve himself from the guilt. But the lasting image of him not being able to look his nephew in the eye really is quite a significant one. The use of the framing narrative, as I've mentioned, creates layers, doesn't it? But it also creates a degree of distance between the speaker of the poem, the nephew, and Giuseppe himself. And that is reflected also in the title. So the title of the poem is just Giuseppe. You might think that something's missing. Why not Uncle Giuseppe? So the title itself also creates a degree of distance, as if the speaker is wanting to distance himself from his uncle's actions. There is the removal of uncle, the removal of a familial connection, the removal of warmth in some degree. So I think even Ford choosing just Giuseppe as the poem's title is, again, quite telling about the nature of guilt and wanting to create that distance. So just to finish up, really, Giuseppe's central kind of questions, burning questions, are about the human capacity for evil, and about how those people who perpetrate horrible acts can justify and live with their crimes. This justification that we see all throughout the poem, or this attempted justification, makes us question whether truly terrible crimes can be justified, or whether the rights of an individual should be sacrificed for the collective good. So remember, they're feeding this mermaid to the troops. Or whether ultimately individual rights should be protected at all costs. I mean, it's a great poem, and it's certainly one that I will remember. I hope you found these comments useful, and yeah, good luck with all your studying.